Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and this is the weekly podcast where I interview the leading voices in true crime, culture, and justice. Just a heads up before we begin. Today's episode deals with sexual assault and domestic violence. If those are topics that could be triggering for you, please listen with care. Or if you need help, please reach out. I will put references in the show notes. You can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. It's 1-800-799-SAFE.
This show contains sensitive content. Nikki Addimando is frozen at a traffic light in Poughkeepsie, New York. It's 2 a.m. Her kids are asleep in the back seat. She sees a cop pull up behind her.
Just one more time, go through the story with me. Is there anybody else in the house, actually? Okay.
For the past 9 years, Nikki has been in a relationship with Chris Grover, a local gymnastics coach and the children's father.
What's his name?
Chris's blood is on Nikki's leggings. Her own blood is in her underwear. She's explaining this to the cops right now.
Obviously, you're in shock right now.
I had sex with me earlier.
Okay.
And
Was that consensual? No? Okay.
Tonight, she says she made a decision to survive. Nikki is sure she acted in self-defense. She thinks the fight for her life is finally over.
He was hurting her really badly.
How many times does her arm have to get dislocated before somebody reports him?
We love a true crime story when the woman is dead. Her naked body is the starting point of most podcasts. Only in death can she secure her status as the perfect victim. No voice, no power, no pulse. That's why Nikki's story is the upside down story. It's the story we don't tell. The one where she survives. But not everybody accepts this version.
I don't believe a word of Nikki Addimando, ever.
There's no flipping way. There's just no way. Because if you knew him as a person, you would say, there's no way.
He was a very loving, patient, caring person who had the misfortune of staying with someone who was plotting out his murder.
Can someone kill but not be a murderer? When can a woman fight back without being punished? I'm Justine Leun. This is Believe Her, a new podcast from Leun Media, launching October 21st.
To them, this was a case. Like, these were my actual experiences. This was my life.
That was a trailer for the new podcast by Leun Media called Believe Her. Today, I'm speaking with the host, Justine Leun, who began reporting on the case of Nikki Addimando in 2017. We tackle some seriously complex themes, including PTSD, women and mothers in prison, the term criminalized survivors, and whether it's bad luck or a bad system that gets people in prison in the first place. I really appreciate Justine's willingness to get into all of that and more, and I highly recommend you listen to Believe Her wherever you get your podcasts. It is an important and thought-provoking story. You can find links to Believe Her and Justine's social media in the show notes. Please remember, if you enjoy this interview and conversation, if you're a fan of Dialogue Podcast, go ahead over to Apple Podcasts, leave a rating and written review. I appreciate it so much. And Justine, thank you for killing the small talk. Justine, welcome to Dialogue Podcast. I am very excited to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me.
The podcast is stunning. So in preparing to talk to you, it was like, where do I begin? Because I love this show so much. And I want to start where you really started, and we're talking about Believe Her, which is with Leun Media. And this is an upside down true crime story. That's one of the ways you position it. Can you please tell me what that means to you?
Sure. I mean, we thought a lot about what genre does this story work in. I'm not sure it was even immediately clear to us that it was true crime, but as we kind of kept going with it, it became clear that it really didn't fit anywhere else. It was true crime, but it also became clear that the common thread in true crime tends to be that she's dead. Like she's always dead. Every single thing I watch, I now realize, seeing it through this new lens, she's dead. And her naked body is the starting point. And that's, I don't want to say it's necessarily what we have for entertainment because it's a reflection of our society, but that's how it goes. And this is a story of survival. She's not dead. And it's the story of what comes next.
You're a journalist by trade. You reported on this story for a long time before anybody would publish it. It took 3 years to get it to come to life through the medium of podcasting. What do you think happened between your first time out pitching and now to where, for whatever reason, the time was right to tell the story? What do you think transpired in those 3 years?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure. I will say that I started in 2018 working on the general subject matter of like women in prison, women in the criminal legal system. And I just remember back then, like everywhere I went with anything on these topics, nothing. I would just get like no response. I couldn't get an email back. It was really weird because I'd actually been reporting on immigration prior to that. And I had been placing things, like I hadn't had that much trouble. And I was so convinced, like, these are stories that need to be told, and particularly Nikki Addimando's story, which is the story that this podcast follows. And I wanted to do a podcast, and I like went around with this podcast to different places. And I knew when I was reporting it for print, which is my primary, like articles, books, etc., I knew it should be a podcast because it was such a complex story and it had so many characters in it. And there was so much more to say than you could put in even a long form article. And I'm not sure if it was a cultural shift. It was a shift in my capacity to tell the story. But I will say that I noticed in 2020, when this was after I published an initial article on this case, around when the pandemic hit, I started doing a lot more articles and projects on this kind of topic, criminalized survival, which I guess we'll get into, and women in prison and women in the criminal legal system. And suddenly, like everything I pitched, like people were taking it and publishing it. So I don't know if something about like Black Lives Matter and people becoming a little bit more engaged in social justice issues and sort of thinking about systemic problems and thinking about, wait, how does our system really work? I don't know if that contributed to a shift, but I mean, I think we saw it elsewhere. Things that were considered very radical suddenly became quite mainstream in a way and acceptable to talk about and to acknowledge. So I can't say why, but I did see that shift happening.
That resonates. And I'm nodding emphatically like a crazy person because just anecdotally, I feel like I saw that in 2020. I think the genre of true crime has expanded to include more than it used to, including stories like this that maybe fell outside the traditional trope that you mentioned. We want a woman to be a perfect angelic victim, or we want her to be a bloodthirsty killer over like a love squabble or whatever. Like it's very messy to put her anywhere else. And so I think you're exactly right, though. I think the social justice issues, police brutality, George Floyd, all of that, those are playing out in the legal system and people are becoming more interested in them. And there's crimes involved. To me, if there's a crime involved, it can be in true crime. And I think using this entertainment vehicle to get close to those issues and explore them more, like to me, that is not a bad thing. It's like getting kids to eat, it's like sneaking in vegetables almost. Like, so I'm just thrilled that it was received and that the time for whatever reason was right. And also not to mention you have so much great audio. So this being a podcast is like a natural extension of the story. Let's talk about the story because people are probably wondering the story of Nikki Addimando. I would love for you to just set the scene for people who haven't started listening, believe her, or aren't familiar with this case, which happened Poughkeepsie, New York, not far from where you and I are at all.
So yeah, the case took place in Poughkeepsie, New York, which is kind of this pretty bucolic suburb along the Hudson River. I remember because I would go up to the trial and I would take the train ride. And even though it was like a really long train ride and I would take it at 5 a.m. for a month, it was beautiful. There's this sparkling river. And then Poughkeepsie's this beautiful suburban town. In 2017, Nikki Addimando, who at the time was 28 years old, shot her partner, who was a gymnastics coach in the town of Poughkeepsie named Chris Grover. They had 2 kids together. They'd been together for 9 years at that time. it's not a whodunit. Like she said, I did this. She immediately waved over a police officer that night and said, this happened, and I did this in self-defense. What followed was a many years long homicide trial where a prosecutor argued that it wasn't self-defense at all. In fact, she was a cold-blooded killer who calculated this, who was a master manipulator, and wanted to send her away for life. And so that's kind of what the story encompasses.
Right. Did you go into the story like, I do believe her, or were you just willing to find the story for whatever it presented itself to be?
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing, and it gets like legal stuff gets so nitty gritty, but if it was self-defense, it's not a crime, right? You can kill someone and it's not a crime. You can kill someone in self-defense. If it's self-defense, it wasn't murder. You did kill them, but you are technically permitted to not die or take on great bodily harm. So I went in knowing very little. There was very little press. It was like local press. It said, something like motive unknown in the Poughkeepsie Journal. It was a lot about the gymnastics teachers killed by his partner. Nobody knows why, like nobody knows what happened, which also was kind of odd to me because upon my investigation, like a lot of people had ideas about this. A lot of people. It was like a huge thing that happened in the town. It really divided the town kind of into two camps. I would say that like with everything that I do on this topic, I go in from a point of believing someone, but not blind belief. The idea, believe all women, it doesn't mean to me, believe people no matter what you find out, or believe people without ever questioning it and just push forward with that. It's more like starting from a place of belief. If you tell me this about your life, like I will not immediately think, no, that didn't happen. And then kind of unraveling it from there. So I started from a place of belief. She said she had been assaulted. She said she had been abused. But I then investigated for years, and there were certainly times at the trial early on, for example, where you get really twisted. And that's what happened in this trial too. Like it was a very mind-bendy experience. What happened with Nikki's story, how the narrative was remade and recast from many different people. And I followed all of that. And then following everything, I amassed an immense amount of documentation, like thousands and thousands of pages. And I interviewed dozens of people. Like, I don't even know. I've sort of lost count at this point. And so the conclusions I came to were very informed conclusions. And I was thinking about how sometimes people are like, it's like, if you come from a place of belief, you're biased. And I'm like, if you spent years investigating something and you didn't come to any point of view, like, what does that say about you? How can you spend so long? I mean, people put people away for a lifetime with like, the stroke of a pen. So I believe her about her life, as the title is. And I don't believe her because ideologically, like I have to believe her. I believe her because I've looked into this case at length.
You're bringing up the meta level of the conversation through the specific case, Nikki's story. And it's like the believe all women or believe all victims all the time. That's an overreaction, but an appropriate one to this time period that we all have endured where we didn't value a woman's story or a victim's story. So it is just a new posture of like, let's start with that. So I like how you position that. It's like, let's start from there and not diminish someone's story right out of the gate. And let's see what unfolds. And you've done your due diligence. So we really appreciate that nuanced approach. Can we talk about the night of the crime and what led up to it?
Yeah. So I would call it the event.
The event.
Not the crime necessarily.
That's a great correction. Yes.
For some time, Nikki had been injured often. And people had noticed, like in the community for years, like she's injured, she's beat up. She's telling some people, she's confessing to them, but she is becoming more and more isolated. She didn't have any money. She had like no money of her own. She made baby booties and sold them for, $30. It would take her forever to make them. They were actually really nice. She's very, very crafty. And that was her only income. And I think it was like $500 to $1,000 a year. Now, they didn't have money in general either. He was a gymnastics coach and she was kind of receding from the community, but people did talk, like, why is she so bruised? She would have bruises on her cheek. Anyways, The night of the killing, somebody had called CPS, and we end up talking to this person. She comes on the show as well, and had said, essentially, like, the mom is bruised and the kids seem like a little anxious. And I think somebody should look into this, which nobody had ever done before. And it seems like that was like the turning point. What it was the turning point of, the prosecution would say one thing and Nikki would say another. In any case, Chris did have a registered gun, and that gun came out that night. He, according to Nikki, he took out the gun and he basically said, I'm going to kill you and I'm going to kill myself. And from there, obviously, we know that she lived and he died. And she has always said that there was a struggle and that she just chose not to die. You know, the rest of that night involves her going to the police station and then things switching. And suddenly she goes from victim, which she had actually been considered in this community and by professionals for like many years, to perpetrator. And from there, that's when the upside down true crime genre commences, I guess, because things like turned upside down. Now she's a cold-blooded killer suddenly in the eyes of the state.
Right. And to add to the complexity of it, she is a victim of abuse going back way early into her life, which we learned pretty early into the podcast that she is a sexual abuse survivor as well. And so the complexities of trauma are just something that most law enforcement and short of, social workers who were kind of aware and tuned into this, it's like we don't know what to do with those complexities, and understanding trauma and the ways that it can manifest and what might look like an overreaction in one situation could actually be explained by all these past events. And so your podcast gets to do what I feel like the court and the legal criminal system is unable to do for people like Nikki. Do you know what I mean? In terms of breaking down those issues and exploring them. And I feel like there should be a way to do it in court. And I know we haven't gotten to the trial part of the podcast. Is there anything you can say about what happened in court in terms of her story being presented in such a way to propel the PTSD narrative?
Yeah, I mean, like, the thing about law enforcement or the state actors, like, not getting it, not understanding trauma, is that I find it sort of odd because prosecutors prosecute on behalf of trauma victims,
right, all
the time.
Right.
So it seems strange, let's say, that a prosecutor who is pro-victim, conceivably, and who prosecutes on behalf of sexual abuse survivors, on behalf of rape survivors, of course, like, doesn't really that much because we know that it's the least prosecuted crime, but theoretically, and who works with special victims and who works with children. It seems very curious to me that such a person wouldn't know anything about how trauma works or re-victimization or PTSD. But nonetheless, in this case, I think we see a real black and white, as you have sort of pointed out, where someone's dead. That's true. Someone's dead. So, like, by definition, for our really black and white legal system, that person's a victim, right? Like, if you're dead, like, you're the victim. So if you're the victim, then someone's the perpetrator. And so you gotta have to slot that person into perpetrator mode. And we interviewed this really fascinating attorney who focuses on gender-based violence. Her name is Lee Goodmark. She's at the University of Maryland School of Law. And she talks about how she sees all the time in her work, that it's very common for people who are abused later in life to have an initial violation. Sure. It's not like, I think in one of our episodes, we have somebody be like, oh, is it so crazy that if you're abused when you're a kid, you might not have great boundaries and relationships with men later in life? Is that so wild? But Lee talks about how she sees often, it's like a switch is flipped. And she has a great line where she's like, it's almost like the prosecutors in these cases can't even believe that they're prosecuting a victim. So they have to erase that victimhood because, like, in their conception of themselves, they're the avenger of wrong and they're there for the victim. And that's their whole purpose in life. So how can they even be doing this? So they have to, like, change the narrative in order to make what they're doing make sense. And I can't know the motives of the prosecutor in this case or the judge or anything that happened at the trial. I can't know what people really felt or thought, but I can say that it certainly seemed like a switch flipped in this case in terms of her being considered a victim prior to this event, prior to Chris's killing, and her being considered a pure perpetrator after.
Right. I am so thrilled to announce that Stamps.com is a sponsor of the show because I personally use and rely on Stamps.com. If you have ever received a t-shirt, mug, note, or sticker from yours truly, it has arrived to you via Stamps.com. Since 1998, Stamps.com has been an indispensable tool for nearly 1 million businesses. Stamps.com brings the services of the U.S. Postal Service and UPS right to your computer. Whether you're an office sending invoices, a side hustle Etsy shop, or a full-blown warehouse shipping out orders, Stamps.com will make your life easier. All you need is a computer and a standard printer. No special supplies or equipment. Within minutes, you're up and running, printing official postage for any letter, any package, anywhere you want to send it. And you'll get exclusive discounts on postage and shipping from USPS and UPS. Once your mail is ready, just schedule a pickup or drop it off. No traffic, no lines. Cut the confusion out of shipping. With Stamps.com's new Rate Advisor tool, you can compare shipping rates and timelines to easily find the best option. Save time and money with Stamps.com. There is no risk. And with my promo code POD, that's POD, you get a special offer that includes a 4-week trial plus free postage and a digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage and type in POD, P-O-D. That's Stamps.com, promo code POD. Stamps.com. Never go to the post office again. Yeah, it's very all or nothing thinking. And also they have the power not to prosecute as well, right? So I think once that decision was made that they weren't going to make this a consideration of self-defense, I guess what you're saying makes perfect sense. They had to go all in on that decision. And this is how you get the conviction, is you have to paint this other opposing narrative. We've mentioned there were several people in Nikki's life. Her midwife comes to mind, the music teacher friend, Elizabeth, who saw warning signs. And more than that, they had Nikki's own testimony saying what was going on there. There wasn't just physical abuse, there was some sexual abuse. It seemed she was really looking for people to answer the question of like, where does consent play into a long-term sexual relationship with a partner? She was looking for people to talk to about that and to seek some answers. Did their testimony come into trial? Were they asked to participate on her defense?
In terms of the trial, I mean, it's just a complicated question. It kind of spans almost all the episodes, like the corroboration, who saw, what they saw, and then a whole different group of people who say they didn't see. And like, because they didn't see, like there was nothing, she must have made it up. And there were a lot of theories about like where the injuries came from, like who did the violence against her. And that was all floated in what has been called a spaghetti against the wall approach, which is to say, throw all the spaghetti against the wall at the trial and see what sticks. So we saw a lot of spaghetti thrown, I think. And I don't know if that's common. I haven't sat through many homicide trials, but like there was a lot of spaghetti on the wall. And it was really interesting to see what stuck and to see what jurors and society are kind of primed for to stick and how that can be utilized against people.
I'm just thinking about, may the best story win. I just interviewed a prosecutor a couple of weeks ago, and he was going after organized crime members. So very, very different, but it really does come down to this duel of story. And I do think there are cultural shifts and places and times where we are more apt to believe something than not. And that's why our whole system sometimes can seem entirely, it's almost like luck sometimes. Like, what if this had happened in a different town or a different prosecutor, or just all these things where the variables can change and you might get a different outcome. And I know what they say, that it works more times than it doesn't, but I still am like, wow, 12 people and, all these factors. But if you remove and change one, you could have a different outcome. It's really wild to me.
So just like to quickly go back to the idea of luck, I think like you would go anywhere and prosecutors win. They win all the time. They win 72% 2% of criminal cases. I believe, and I speak on correction, it's like 90% of people take a plea in certain cases. So I feel like, is that luck? What I see is a design happening where it's like, sure, you could be lucky and have that one juror, but for the most part, if you go to trial, you're screwed. Or you have money, like lots and lots of money to pay a criminal attorney. But what I also think is interesting is that if you're on trial for like a serious crime and you often like have never been on trial before, right? Sure. Prosecutors are going every day. They know what they're doing. If you're Nikki, like you never killed someone before. So you don't have that kind of like 30 years of experience defending yourself against this. Like you do not know what to do. Yeah. And I think that's quite common. So I just wanted to touch on that.
No, I think that's such a good point.
Yeah.
I believe there are absolutely systemic flaws in how it's set up. The luck part, I think I was referring more to like, let's say it happened to me and I happen to be in a progressive jurisdiction where the prosecutor recognized it for what it was. Now, that's not luck to me. That's the system working as it should and identifying that case and saying, we're not going to bring the charges against her. This is what this was. And we don't want to charge her with this. And that in a given place and time, like a smaller town in a different county, they don't have that way of thinking. And it's about someone died and someone has to pay. That mentality and probably like small town pressure from the family, like there is a victim. I understand that. So they choose to prosecute, like that difference.
Although, Dutchess County is like New York, like that's what I would have thought. But like we're in New York State. It's not.
I know it's not like the middle of the country. I know.
And this same thing is happening in New York City right now with a woman named Tracy McCarter. And I've seen another woman, an elderly woman, and I forget her name, in the middle of the country, who is being prosecuted for what she says is self-defense from her abuser for many years. And I saw on the news, the guy's brother, his elderly brother said, everything she says about my brother is true. He was a monster. He did this to her. And she's still on trial, potentially in prison. So it's a very weird thing where I would have thought that also. But following this, I see it. To me, it's a thing about prosecutors. That's me. I mean, that's my opinion, like an unfettered power. And I think some people would say this is how the system is supposed to work. Some people would say it's working as it's designed to work. Of course, I have an Apple review that says the show's too political.
That's really interesting because I wouldn't say that at all. In fact, you give a lot of airtime to the bad facts of the case. And I feel like it's very fair. You talk about Chris, you talk about who he was, you let his family's story in to an extent. I don't know how many chose to speak with you directly, but accounts of who he was, you gave him a presence and a voice, and also the things that worked against Nikki's case. They are what are called bad facts, and you spend a lot of time unpacking those. And I don't know, that's pretty fair. That's what reporting should do, right? You can't go in with blinders and ignore those, or you could have left them out, but I don't think that would have been as thorough or as honest or fair.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, thank you. I appreciate it. I mean, we had to confront them because they were brought in. So we have to like look at them, these bad facts, and like look at what does it mean and what is like people are flawed, their stories aren't perfect, and we have to kind of unravel that. And in terms of bringing Chris in, I would just say that I don't think it behooves anyone to think of anyone as an abstraction, right? Yes. Like, if we believe Nikki that she was abused, which I think is a reasonable belief, like it's also worth noting that abusers don't wear shirts that say like, I'm, it's kind of a secret. And most people who've been in abusive relationships say that the person they were with like was quite beloved. That's often, he would do anything for anyone. Like he was a great guy. Kids loved him. The two things can be true, you know, and so I think we also wanted to give that credence, like the idea that if someone presents one way in public or to you doesn't mean that in private he's not a different person, or even she's not. I mean, that works for anybody. Like your experience with a person, right, is not the only experience with that person.
I just want to add, like, this comes up all the time, that nobody is all one thing or another either, right? So I think that's what I'm speaking to as well, is including that in the show, bears that out. And that goes for victims too. Like, you can be an imperfect victim. This whole notion that the only way we get, one of the quotes from the show, the only good victim is a dead one. You say this in the podcast earlier. That is the way I think we've been operating and what we've been fed and what we've come to expect for so long. And I think finally it's like victims can have very complicated histories, and we might not even like someone that got murdered. And it doesn't mean we should care less. Like, let's say this story had gone the other way and it had been Nikki and all these other things came up about her. It's like, it's this weird all or nothing thinking, like with the justice system and with humans, that just simply doesn't exist. It's always like this messier middle. So I appreciate that presentation of him as a person. Now I would love to hear about Nikki and your impression of her and how she struck you.
I mean, it's funny to talk about sort of like the idea of the perfect victim and what we require of our victims.
Yes.
And to lead into Nikki, like, she's actually quite unusual in the sense that she does present in many ways as that perfect victim. Right. She is white, she is straight, you know, she was a stay-at-home mom, she was a former preschool teacher. In a lot of ways, she was quite traditional, except that she didn't die, right? I see all the time with the work that I do that most victims really aren't perfect at all, because they're up against so much in their lives that they have chaotic pasts. That's what leads you into the criminal legal system. That's what leads you into these situations. There is random stuff that happens to people, of course, but for the most part, you don't find yourself in really bad situations unless there are a lot of other things that have sort of gone wrong on the way.
Yep.
So the idea that like the perfect victim has to be that way is ridiculous. Like it's actually the opposite of what I've typically seen. But my impressions of Nikki, like, what can I say about her? It was interesting because in a way I've been listening to the episodes of this show where I've talked and we've kind of put together almost this collage, which is interesting to me because Nikki is a collage artist. She loves making collages, and listening to the show, I've almost got a fuller sense of her than I've ever had before. Nikki is, I would say, at least presents as very shy and very quiet, which I think kind of worked against her. Like, I think it made authorities frustrated sometimes that she wouldn't like advocate for herself or speak up. But she's fundamentally just like a cool person, I would say. She's a mom, first and foremost. She can be funny, you know, like she's very smart. She's very, very creative. And I think it's really nice in this show that we get to really hear her voice start coming through.
Yeah.
And my feeling is that with time, like Nikki's voice will be in the world more and more. I think she's got a lot to say that hasn't been heard. And I hope that she'll have a chance to speak more and more.
That's exciting. So you said she's a mom first and foremost, and that comes out really clearly in the first couple of episodes. She prioritized her kids in a way that is, I mean, you might say enviable. It's impressive. So I'm at the point in the podcast where she's been separated from them and she's being held in jail while all this is getting worked out. And I feel like that is another trauma for sure, for the children, for her. How has that been for the kids who were 2 and 4 at the time of the event? I'm sure there's some kind of new normal. I don't know if it ever gets normal. I'm curious about that. I imagine that's got to be one of the toughest losses for her, is like not to be able to parent in the way that she would be outside.
80% of the population of women's prisons are moms and are primary caretakers. So that's something like 230,000 women and girls in facilities, with 80% being moms, most of them being primary caretakers. I think that's really distinct from the experience of men. Like when a woman is taken out of the family, a lot of things fall apart. Yeah. And so I think it's very common. A lot of people that I've talked to have their kids in foster care or state care and lose track of their kids. Like you literally can't even hear from your kid. I don't think anyone ever reconciles it. I don't think the children ever get over it. I don't think they're thought of as collateral damage. They're thought of as like, well, your mom messed up, so like, what are we going to do? In Nikki's case, she's been very lucky in a sense because her sister has stepped up and has taken the children in. That's also sort of common in the way that women on the outside really like hold up all of the brokenness from what our criminal legal system does. I see that all the time. I would say like primarily Black women and women of color are holding up like entire communities by taking on the burden of these children that have just been thought of as kind of expendable. Her sister they have contact, they see each other as much as they can. They're on the phone all the time, but it's like, I've heard her say, for example, that she saw new freckles on them. To imagine to see your kids have a new freckle that like you just look at and you didn't see it before. Yeah. And now the daughter has been with her sister for far longer than she was ever with her own mother.
Wow.
And her son, she has been away from her son for longer than she was ever with him at this point. She passed that milestone. And so I don't know. I don't think you ever really reconcile it. You do the best that you can. You feel lucky that like your family picked up the pieces, but nobody's getting over it.
Yeah.
People can learn to live with it because they can learn to live with anything. You can never get over that. And I find that's really common. Also, that's probably the biggest pain for people in women's prisons in particular, is that they can't mother their kids, and there's often no mechanism with which they can stay in touch. Nikki's lucky because her sisters facilitated that in her community. Wow. And I should add that it's like really expensive. Private corporations own the telecommunications. So every time you want to have a call with your kid, it's costing you a couple bucks, which means that every day, say you're spending $4 or $5 if you want to stay in touch, plus an email is 30 cents, which sounds little, but people in prison are often quite poor, didn't have money to begin with. And so it's like this very destructive thing where it's super expensive and you're paying into a private corporation called JPay, which is owned by, so, you're paying into JPay or Securus so that somebody is really massively profiting so that a mom and a kid who did nothing, whatever you think of the mom, can have a phone call for 20 minutes and then it's cut off. So to me, this is one of like the most egregious things I've ever seen is like, JPay. JPay to me is like one of the most toxic things because a cell phone is free. A cell phone is free and a call is really free. Like when I do my reporting, I factor in often like thousands of dollars into grant money to be able to stay in touch with people in prison.
Right. My gosh. Yeah, it adds up if you were trying to be in touch on a consistent basis. You mentioned, I don't want to put you on the spot with statistics. You mentioned one about 80% of the women being mothers in prison. And I believe there was another stat in the show about the number of women who were responsible for like a domestic, what's the right word? What am I trying to say?
Criminalized survival, maybe?
Yes, let's use that. That sounds like the right thing. How many women around are in prison for being punished for surviving in their domestic partnership?
So there's no data, except that I'm in the middle of collecting data for a book that I'm writing. And my initial analysis is that 30% of those people are in prison because they tried to protect themselves or a loved one from physical or sexual violence. I think the number is low, but it still would, if it's representative nationwide, be thousands and thousands of people. Oh, yeah. And it's been going on since at least 1866, which is when maybe it was 1855, which is when the first case of criminalized survival was recorded, which is an enslaved woman named Celia who protected herself against the man who had purchased her when she was 14 years old and was then convicted and hanged. So it's like a long-term thing. I think it's probably affected an immense amount of people and we don't even know it, because I'm also just working on the cases of people I'm being very selective and I'm dealing with murder and manslaughter, but it obviously has a ripple effect. And it obviously is something that I think there are probably a lot of people there for other charges that were also just trying to live or just trying to survive. Obviously, people do commit crimes. People do this, that, or the other thing. But I just think, as we can see so clearly in Nikki's case, sometimes people were just trying to survive. And for that, they're put in prison, sometimes for a lifetime.
Yeah, the story reminded me when I was listening of Centoya Brown's story. I'm sure you know, but I actually had never heard criminalized survival. I'd never heard that term. So do you know what the origin of it is? I mean, you mentioned that first 1855 case, but do you know when that phrase started becoming used?
The first time I've seen it used was by a group called Survived and Punished, and particularly a educator and activist named Mariam Kaba, who they put criminalized survival as a kind of on this advocacy website, Survived and Punished. And I've read it there used as a way to reframe like battered women syndrome, which is not including a lot of people, like, again, requiring that perfect victim, putting the idea of like self-defense as a, psychological issue that you're having, as opposed to just a reaction that you're taking to danger. But that's where I first saw it come to use. And it was recently. I think that organization, Survived and Punished, I want to say was started in 2016, maybe.
Okay.
And they focused on criminalized survivors, primarily Black and brown women, immigrants, LGBTQ. I think it's a fascinating term, and I think it's really accurate for what I see.
Yeah, I'm really glad that there's a name for something to put to these cases where other things aren't fitting. So without spoiling, because, we want people to listen, and Nikki does there's a journey and there's a story, and this podcast is going to take you through it. What could listeners look forward to? Or what can we expect in a future episode?
The story is all wild. It's like watching a trial take place, listening to what makes it, what doesn't. We have an episode on the missing evidence. We have an episode that looks at an angle that's about Pornhub, which is crazy. There's voices that never made it to trial. There's just a ton of twists and turns. Like, it's not a whodunit, but it's worth continuing through to the end. I think because also you learn so much about the system and a family and really the granular stuff that goes down. But to me, the narrative is so propulsive that if I wasn't sort of torn away from this podcast, I could probably keep going with the story for a long time.
Well, that's how it feels listening. It definitely carries you, and the voices you hear from and the actual audio that you got. I mean, it just really sets a scene, and it's stunning. It's beautiful, but it's harrowing. It's all the things, that, I'm someone who likes to lean into those big feelings. I think my audience is as well. So excited for with your multiple true crime podcasts. You're interested in that darker. I know. Go figure. I know. So unexpected. Well, before I let you go, I do ask all my guests, if it was going to be your last meal tonight, what would you eat?
Oh God, probably a lot of carbohydrates. I think probably I would eat a lot of pasta. Yeah. With a lot of cheese. Maybe I would eat like a really great macaroni and cheese. I'm a vegetarian, but I think I'd probably eat like a very high calorie, dense Southern style vegetarian meal. Yes. I might even eat fried chicken if it was my last meal. Right. Who cares? I don't have a taste for it, but maybe I would in the last meal. Cake. I think I would have cake. I hope I didn't put you into an existential tailspin. Right. I feel like existential tailspin is pretty par for the course. It's fine. Okay, good. Good. I like that. I'll take the mac and cheese. It's fine. We'll love the show. What days do the new episodes come out? The episodes come out on Thursdays. Thank you so much. It's really nice to hear from people connecting with it.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, audio engineered by Jason Usry and produced, hosted, and edited by me, Rebecca Sebastian. If you love the podcast, please consider becoming a diehard by signing up at patreon.com/dialogue. Other ways to support the show? Follow along on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across platforms, and you can now watch most episodes on YouTube by subscribing to my channel, Rebecca Sebastian. For more information or to drop me a note, visit RebeccaSebastian.com. Until next time, thank you for listening and killing the small talk.